For over a decade, a geneticist at Harvard has been quietly digging through the DNA of the dead, pulling genetic material from bones thousands of years old. What he found didn't just rewrite history books. It destroyed one of humanity's oldest and most dangerous ideas. His name is David Reich, and his laboratory doesn't look like the setting for a revolution. It looks like any other university lab, full of centrifuges, sequencing machines, and stacks of paper covered in genetic code. But inside that quiet room, Reich and his colleagues have been running one of the most consequential investigations in the history of science. Their case file isn't made of fingerprints or witness statements. It's made of teeth, femurs, and skull fragments, some of them tens of thousands of years old, pulled from caves, burial mounds, and frozen tundra across 4 continents. The question driving this investigation sounds simple on the surface. Where did we come from, and how are we all related to each other? But the answers Reich and his team have uncovered have quietly dismantled a belief that has shaped human societies, wars, laws, and hatreds for centuries. That belief is the idea of the pure bloodline, the notion that somewhere out there exists a population untouched by outside influence, a group of people whose ancestry runs in one unbroken, unmixed line back through the centuries. For most of human history, this idea wasn't just accepted, it was assumed. Kings claimed pure descent from gods. Empires justified conquest by claiming racial purity and superiority. Entire nations built immigration laws, caste systems, and genocidal policies on the premise that blood could be pure or impure, and that keeping it pure was worth defending at any cost. This wasn't a fringe idea whispered in the shadows. It was written into textbooks, sermons, and government policy across the world for generations. And then came the technology that could actually test it. For most of the 20th century, scientists studying human ancestry were limited to comparing living people. They could look at blood types, skin color, skull shapes, and eventually the DNA of people alive today, and try to reconstruct the past by inference. It was a bit like trying to solve a decades-old crime using only photographs of the suspect's grandchildren. Useful, but indirect, and full of gaps that could be filled with bias as easily as with fact. Then, starting in the early 2000s, a technological breakthrough changed everything. Scientists learned how to extract and sequence genetic material directly from ancient bones and teeth, degraded and fragmented as they were by thousands of years underground. Suddenly, researchers weren't just guessing about the past from modern clues. They were reading messages written directly by the people who lived it, preserved in their own cells for millennia. David Reich became one of the pioneers of this new science, ancient DNA analysis, and his lab turned into something like a global crime lab for human history. Bone fragments arrived from Siberia, from the Iberian Peninsula, from the steppes of Central Asia, from caves in the Middle East. Each sample held a genetic time capsule, a snapshot of a real human being who lived, breathed, and died long before written history began. What his team started finding, sample after sample, region after region, was almost never what anyone expected. Take Europe, a continent whose national identities are often wrapped up in centuries-old claims of ancestral homelands and ancient bloodlines. When Reich's team sequenced ancient European DNA, they discovered that the population of the continent had not simply existed in place, slowly evolving in isolation for tens of thousands of years. Instead, the genetic record revealed wave after wave of mass migration and replacement. Hunter-gatherers who had lived across Europe for thousands of years were largely displaced or absorbed by farmers migrating up from Anatolia in what is now Turkey. Then, thousands of years later, a completely different population swept in from the steppes north of the Black and Caspian Seas, bringing with them new languages, new technologies, and a genetic signature that transformed the continent yet again. In other words, the very people who might proudly claim to be the original, authentic inhabitants of their homeland were, according to their own DNA, descendants of at least 3 distinct and dramatically different ancestral populations, layered on top of each other through repeated migration and mixing. There was no single untouched founding population waiting quietly at the root of the family tree. There was only a long, complicated, ongoing story of movement. The same pattern showed up again and again as Reich's team expanded their investigation. In South Asia, ancient DNA revealed that the modern population of the Indian subcontinent descends from a blend of at least 2 highly distinct ancestral groups, one related to ancient Iranian farmers and one connected to hunter-gatherer populations already living in South Asia, with later contributions from Central Asian steppe populations as well. In the Americas, genetic evidence traced the ancestors of indigenous peoples back through multiple migratory waves out of Asia, contradicting simpler stories about a single founding population crossing a single land bridge at a single moment in time. Piece by piece, cave by cave, tooth by tooth, the picture assembled by ancient DNA told the same story on every continent. Human history was not a story of isolated, static populations that stayed the same for tens of thousands of years. It was a story of constant motion. groups expanding into new territory, encountering other groups, sometimes replacing them, sometimes merging with them, sometimes both, over and over across the millennia. At a talk given at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, Reich summed up the core discovery in a single, striking sentence. Today, he explained, humanity is more genetically similar than at almost any point in our history, because the ancient populations that once existed were often far more different from each other than any two people alive today. 70,000 years ago, there were at least 5 distantly related human groups occupying different corners of the planet. Since then, those lines have been crossing, merging, and blending, generation after generation, until the sharp divisions of the deep past dissolved into the far more interconnected mixed humanity we recognize today. This finding lands like a plot twist because it inverts almost everything the old mythology of racial purity assumed. The old story imagined humanity fracturing over time into separate, pure branches that needed to be protected from mixing. The real story, written in the DNA itself, shows the opposite. Humanity started out more genetically distinct in isolated pockets, separated by geography and time, and has been gradually converging, mixing, and blending ever since. If anything, we are less separated today than our ancient ancestors were from each other, and this isn't a fringe interpretation from one outlier scientist. It echoes a discovery that first made headlines at the turn of the millennium, when researchers completed the initial sequencing of the human genome. At that moment, one of the key scientists behind the effort stood in front of the world's media and delivered a line that should have ended the conversation about biological race for good. The concept of race, he said, has no genetic or scientific basis. His research team had sequenced the genomes of several individuals identified by different racial and ethnic labels, and found that their scientists, working blind, could not reliably distinguish one labeled group from another based on the genetic code alone. All human beings, regardless of ancestry, share more than 99.9% of their DNA in common. That number is worth sitting with for a moment, 99.9%. The tiny fraction of genetic variation left over, less than 0.1%, is where all human physical differences come from: skin tone, hair texture, eye shape, height, and everything else we've historically used to sort people into rigid categories. And crucially, that small slice of variation does not cluster into neat, separate boxes that match old racial categories. It flows in gradients, shifting gradually as you move across geography, a pattern scientists call clean-all variation. There is no clean line in the genome where one race stops and another begins, because biologically, no such line exists. There's a detail in this story that rarely makes it into the headlines, but it might be the most striking piece of evidence of all. When Reich's team and other ancient DNA researchers began comparing modern human genomes to genetic material recovered from Neanderthal fossils, they discovered something that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Most people alive today, outside of certain African populations, carry a small but measurable percentage of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes, a leftover signature from interbreeding that happened tens of thousands of years ago when modern humans expanding out of Africa encountered Neanderthal populations already living across Europe and Asia. Later research uncovered a second, even stranger chapter to this story. Populations across parts of Asia and the Pacific carry DNA from a mysterious group of ancient humans known as Denisovans, identified initially from nothing more than a single finger bone and a few teeth discovered in a Siberian cave. These findings mean that the story of human mixing doesn't stop at the boundaries of our own species. It reaches even further back into encounters between modern humans and entirely different branches of the human family tree. Branches that no longer exist today except as fragments preserved inside our own DNA. Reich has described this layered history as looking less like a simple family tree and more like a tangled river delta, with streams of ancestry splitting apart, flowing in different directions for thousands of years, and then rejoining again and again as populations encountered each other across the landscape. That image captures something the old idea of racial purity could never account for. A tree has clean branches, a delta has constant confluence, and, according to the genetic evidence, humanity's actual history looks far more like the delta. Reich's team has extended this investigation methodically, region by region, continent by continent, treating each new set of skeletal remains almost like a new witness called to the stand. In East Asia, ancient DNA revealed complex layers of migration involving early hunter-gatherer populations, later agricultural expansions, and repeated contact between northern and southern lineages that modern political borders don't remotely reflect. In the Pacific, researchers traced the extraordinary voyages of early seafaring populations who mixed with earlier inhabitants of islands they encountered along the way, leaving genetic traces of contact spanning thousands of miles of open ocean. In the Middle East, a region often treated in popular imagination as an ancient and unchanging cradle of civilization, ancient genomes revealed repeated waves of migration, and mixing between farming populations, herding populations, and hunter-gatherers stretching back over 10,000 years. Even in sub-Saharan Africa, the birthplace of our species and the region holding the deepest reservoir of human genetic diversity, ancient DNA studies have revealed complex histories of migration and mixing between different regional populations, rather than a single unchanging ancestral group sitting quietly at the root of the human story. Researchers have identified genetic evidence of population movements linked to the spread of farming and iron-working technologies across the continent thousands of years ago, movements that reshaped the genetic landscape of Africa just as dramatically as later migrations reshaped Europe and Asia. In other words, even the region popular imagination sometimes imagines as the single unchanging origin point turns out, on closer genetic inspection, to be just as dynamic, just as layered, and just as thoroughly mixed as everywhere else on the planet. There is, quite simply, no corner of the globe, no remote valley, no isolated coastline where the evidence points toward isolation instead of exchange. No population anywhere whose genome tells a story of standing still rather than moving, meeting, and mixing. This is where the detective story takes an unexpected turn, because the myth of racial purity didn't just fail to hold up, it turned out to have a traceable origin story of its own, one rooted less in biology and more in politics. Historians and geneticists who have studied the concept of racial purity point out that it emerged from a particular era, one shaped by European colonial expansion and the desire to justify hierarchies of power. Populations were sorted, ranked, and labeled not because clean biological divisions actually existed in nature, but because those divisions were useful for building empires, defending slavery, restricting immigration, and rationalizing violence against people deemed impure or inferior. The pure race wasn't discovered in a laboratory. It was invented in service of a social agenda, and then dressed up in the language of science to make it seem inevitable and natural rather than constructed. It's worth walking through exactly how that invention happened, because the details reveal just how deliberately the myth was constructed. Long before anyone had ever seen a strand of DNA, naturalists and philosophers in colonial-era Europe began sorting human beings into rigid categories based on superficial physical traits, skin color, skull measurements, and facial features, and then assigning those categories a ranked order of supposed intelligence, morality, and worth. These classification systems were presented at the time as objective science, complete with charts, measurements, and elaborate terminology designed to sound authoritative. In reality, the categories were built backward from a predetermined conclusion. The people doing the classifying placed themselves and their own populations at the top of the hierarchy and used the resulting framework to justify colonization, forced labor, and the dispossession of land from people they had just classified as inferior. This wasn't a quiet academic exercise confined to university lecture halls. It shaped immigration quotas that decided who could enter entire nations based on their supposed racial category. It justified laws banning marriage between people classified into different racial groups. It provided the intellectual scaffolding for eugenics movements that sterilized people against their will and, in their most horrifying extreme, provided part of the ideological foundation for genocide in the 20th century. The language of racial purity wasn't an incidental piece of vocabulary. It was a load-bearing wall in some of history's most destructive political projects, and it was built centuries before anyone had the tools to test whether it was even biologically accurate. When those tools finally arrived, first through blood typing in the early 20th century, then through genetic sequencing decades later, and finally through ancient DNA analysis in just the last 20 years, the foundation didn't just weaken. It collapsed completely under the weight of actual evidence. Every new data set, every new set of ancient bones, sequenced in Reich's lab and others like it around the world, told the same story. A story with no clean racial categories, no consistent hierarchy, and absolutely no pure, unmixed population anywhere in the historical record. The classifications invented to justify colonial power turned out to have never described biological reality at all. They described a political fiction dressed up as science, one that modern genetics has now spent 2 decades systematically dismantling. Even some of the scientific terminology used today carries the fingerprints of that history. Researchers studying human population genetics have increasingly raised concerns about words like admixture, a term commonly used to describe the genetic blending between different ancestral groups. On its surface, it sounds neutral, almost clinical. But some scientists argue the term quietly assumes the existence of once pure, separate populations that later became mixed, smuggling the old racial framework back in through the back door of technical language. Because if David Reich's research proves anything, it's that there was no pure population sitting at the start of the story, waiting to be admixed. There was only mixing all the way down, as far back as the evidence can reach. This is perhaps the most unsettling part of the discovery for anyone attached to the old story. It's not simply that different racial groups have mixed a little over time, leaving some untouched core intact underneath. It's that there is no untouched core to find. Every population studied through ancient DNA, without exception, turns out to be the product of previous mixing events stretching back further and further, layer upon layer, migration upon migration, with no bedrock of purity ever appearing, no matter how far back the investigation digs. Consider what this means for some of history's most cherished national and ethnic origin stories. Groups who have spent generations insisting on their unbroken, singular ancestral lineage, tracing back to one founding population in one ancestral homeland, are consistently shown by their own genomes to be far more complicated than that. The ancestors of modern Europeans include Anatolian farmers and steppe herders who arrived from thousands of miles away. The ancestors of many East Asian populations include multiple waves of migration and interbreeding between distinct groups across tens of thousands of years. Even populations often held up as isolated and unchanged, like certain island or remote regional groups, reveal genetic evidence of contact and mixing with outside populations when their DNA is examined closely enough. There's another twist buried in this story, one that Reich's research, and others like it, have uncovered almost as a side effect. It turns out that the deepest, most significant divide in the human genetic record isn't between what we've traditionally called separate races at all. It's a divide tied to geographic origin in Africa versus everywhere else, because every non-African population on Earth descends from a relatively small group that migrated out of Africa tens of thousands of years ago. That means populations within Africa carry more overall genetic diversity among themselves than exists between any non-African population and any other non-African population on the planet. Two people from different regions within Africa can be more genetically distinct from each other than a person from Norway is from a person in Japan. That single fact alone dismantles the tidy hierarchy that old racial pseudoscience tried to build, because the deepest genetic diversity in the entire human species exists within the very continent that racist ideology historically placed at the bottom of its invented ladder. This raises an obvious question for anyone who has ever spit into a tube and mailed it off to a consumer ancestry testing company, waiting weeks for a pie chart, claiming to reveal exactly what percentage of their heritage traces to this region or that one. If there's no such thing as a pure population, what exactly are these tests measuring, and can their results be trusted at all? The honest answer, according to the scientists behind this research, is more nuanced than either the marketing on the box or the skeptics online tend to suggest. These companies aren't inventing categories out of thin air. They're comparing a customer's genetic markers to reference databases built from people whose recent ancestry is well documented, and calculating statistical similarity to those reference groups. That can produce genuinely useful, broadly accurate information about recent geographic ancestry, especially over the last few hundred years. What it cannot do, and what no legitimate scientist claims it can do, is identify a person's race in any biologically meaningful sense, or trace their lineage back to some pure, singular ancestral population. The percentages on that pie chart are estimates of similarity to modern reference populations, not proof of membership in an ancient, unmixed bloodline, because the deeper research consistently shows that no such bloodline exists to trace back to in the first place. This distinction matters far beyond personal curiosity about ancestry. It matters in courtrooms, where forensic genetics is sometimes used to estimate the likely ancestry of a suspect from DNA left at a crime scene. It matters in medicine, where researchers study genetic variation across populations to better understand disease risk and drug response. Work that requires precision and nuance specifically, because broad racial categories turn out to be poor proxies for the genetic factors that actually matter. And it matters in the broader public conversation, where headlines promising to reveal the purest race on Earth, or to rank populations by genetic superiority, exploit a real interest in ancestry and identity while smuggling in a framework that legitimate geneticists rejected decades ago. The science of human genetic variation is fascinating, rigorous, and genuinely revealing. It's also, according to virtually every serious researcher working in the field today, incompatible with the language of racial ranking and purity that so much of the internet still traffics in. None of this means human populations are identical, or that ancestry doesn't matter. Geography, migration, and history have absolutely left real, measurable signatures in our DNA, and scientists can use those signatures to trace ancestry, study disease risk, and reconstruct migration patterns with impressive precision. That part of the science is real, well-established, and genuinely useful. What the evidence rejects isn't the idea that populations have distinct histories. It's the idea that those histories sort neatly into a small number of pure, separate, rankable categories called races, with clear boundaries and inherent hierarchies. The genome simply doesn't work that way. It never has. This is ultimately why Reich's decade of digging through ancient bones carries weight far beyond academic journals and laboratory walls. It's not just an abstract scientific correction. It's a direct challenge to ideologies that have justified real-world violence, discrimination, and injustice by claiming the backing of biology. When someone insists their bloodline is pure and untouched, when a movement builds its identity around defending racial purity from outside mixing, the actual physical evidence recovered from thousands of ancient skeletons across every inhabited continent says, quite simply, that this concept doesn't exist and never has. Every single human being alive today is the product of repeated migration, encounter, and mixing, stretching back generation after generation, population after population, all the way to our shared origins. There is no exception. There is no untouched lineage waiting to be found in some remote valley or isolated island. The deeper scientists dig into the genetic record, the more consistently the same conclusion emerges from every corner of the globe. We are, every one of us without exception, descendants of countless unions between groups our ancestors might once have considered foreign, distant, or other. The very idea of racial purity isn't just scientifically unsupported, it's actively contradicted by the deepest, most rigorous genetic evidence humanity has ever produced. And that conclusion doesn't come from a single controversial voice. It comes from an enormous and growing body of research, built bone by bone, genome by genome, across labs and continents, all converging on the same striking answer. The mystery of where we truly come from has, in a sense, been solved, and the solution turns out to be far more interesting than any myth of pure ancestry ever was. We didn't descend from a handful of separate, untouched founding populations, who occasionally reluctantly mixed. We descended from populations that were already blending, moving, and merging long before recorded history began, and we have never stopped. The mixing isn't a deviation from some pure original state. The mixing is, and always has been, the actual story of our species. So the next time someone speaks confidently about pure bloodlines, ancient unmixed ancestry, or a hierarchy of racial purity, it's worth remembering what the evidence actually shows. Somewhere in a Harvard laboratory and in dozens of other research centers around the world, scientists have spent years extracting the genetic testimony of the dead, letting ancient teeth and bones speak for themselves. And what they've said, consistently, undeniably, across every continent and every era examined, is that there was never a pure population to begin with. There was only ever one long, continuous, deeply human story of movement, encounter, and mixing, written into every strand of DNA that exists today. It's a discovery that took decades, thousands of samples, and the painstaking labor of researchers working across dozens of countries and disciplines, from archaeology to statistics to molecular biology, all converging on a single, coherent picture written in the shared code of life itself. That is the real discovery, and unlike the myths it replaces, it isn't built on assumption or ideology. It's built on evidence, recovered painstakingly from the remains of the people who actually lived it, and confirmed again and again by scientists with no motive other than to find out what's true. In the end, the story hiding inside our DNA is not one of purity, hierarchy, or separation. It's a story of connection, one that ties every person alive today to a shared, tangled, endlessly mixed human family tree, stretching back further than any myth of pure ancestry could ever reach.